Welcome to the Freedom to Learn podcast. I'm your host, Ginny Gentles. This season, we're diving into what it means to return education to states, communities, and families. And we're exploring what becomes possible when education is freed from union dominance and federal control. Bipartisanship may be rare in Washington, but it still exists. This week, Christy Wolfe of the Bipartisan Policy Center joins us to discuss the Commission on the American Workforce's sweeping new blueprint to connect education to opportunity. And we also discuss BPC's federal education policy action items. We cover why federal programs remain stubbornly siloed, why Congress hasn't reauthorized major education laws, and whether the Department of Education is truly a pass-through agency. Christy shares her views on what interagency agreements mean in practice, the real barriers to state flexibility from waiver fatigue to talent constraints, and why some of the biggest obstacles to innovation may actually sit at the state rather than the federal level. With more than 30 years shaping federal education policy across Congress, the U.S. Department of Education, and the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, Christy brings a rare, full-spectrum view of how policy is actually made and implemented. Christy Wolfe, welcome to Freedom to Learn.
It's so nice to be here. Thanks for having me, Ginny.
You work at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and bipartisan isn't a word we hear around Washington too much these days. What's the mission of the organization?
Yeah, so the Bipartisan Policy Center was formed about 20 years ago with a bipartisan, as you might expect, cohort from Congress, Senator Dole and Daschle in particular, really wanting to show folks that it's possible to get things done in Congress, even if you have differing views across a wide spectrum. It doesn't require you to give up those views. It requires you to really just get to the heart of the problems that you're trying to solve. And BPC covers a range of issues from housing, which has been getting a lot of attention these days, to economic policy, to elections, and now human capital, since Margaret Spellings arrived a year and a half ago. And that includes now K-12 education.
BPC has been getting some attention for a recent report. And this is a report of the Commission on the American Workforce. It's a blueprint for a national strategy to connect people to opportunity.
The name of the report is From a Nation at Risk to a Nation at Work. And it really seeks to holistically look at from a federal perspective and the federal role in all of these areas, like how can we have better coordinated efforts in the childcare space, pre-K, K-12, post-secondary, higher education into workforce, to really address the problems that are facing our nation today with AI in the workforce, the challenges of education and educational outcomes, and the declines that we're seeing, especially for the lowest performing kids. It's consistently dropping. How can you look at that in a holistic way? I think because of the way Congress has addressed the statutes, they're all very siloed. You have the Higher Education Act, you have the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, you have a different committee addressing some other issues even. So this report really tries to tie all the threads together. How can you have, with executive leadership, with the National Talent Council, really look at the data holistically, the research holistically, and make sure that Americans can flourish in the workforce and as human beings.
We've talked in a recent episode about IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, not being reauthorized for over 20 years. And up at the top of the webpage that hosts this report, you point out that a lot of these federal laws haven't been reauthorized for a really long time. Why is that? Is Congress afraid to tackle these issues? Are other issues just drawing their attention elsewhere?
Yeah, I think that it's a combination of a lot of things. It seems like we've gotten to a point where Congress acts when it has to mitigate catastrophe or to keep laws in place that are required to keep funding. So you have NDEA, the National Defense Authorization Act. You have the Farm Bill, although even that has become less of a must-pass bill. And then the appropriations bills, which also seem to be... So to get out to a point where you can convince members of Congress that there's a significant sense of urgency that it's worthwhile to spend the political capital to get things done. Just has not been the case. And then, you have folks that are just afraid of reopening it as well. The cost benefit, like, will we get a better law if we push to get the law reopened? And I think that's certainly the case with the Individual Disabilities Education Act. Like, there's not been consensus that this is a great time to revisit everything.
You've issued a series of what I find highly digestible reports that are explaining key components of federal K-12 education policy. Who is your audience? Is it the congressional staff? Is it broader than that?
Yeah, it's congressional staff and broader. In order for us as an organization, as BPC, entering into the conversation to try to bring more bipartisanship, there's a lot of information out there where people can get maybe older or very dense information about how these programs work. But what I'm trying to do is to provide for someone who knows nothing and just wants to start getting to understand, what do I need to know to understand these programs? Is that primarily congressional staff? Yeah, but also, again, with this cross-cutting work that we're trying to do, like, we want to break down some of the silos. And so maybe there's some labor staff at committees or folks in outside organizations that primarily focus on workforce. And maybe it's a time for them to start learning a little bit more about how these education programs work. For folks at the state level, it's surprising to me, again, how narrow folks' aperture can be, even within state and local educational agencies. They work with a particular program and that's it.
Yeah. And when you say that there are dense resources out there, I think of the Congressional Research Service or CRS, and the brilliant staff just do an incredible job creating very detailed reports, but sometimes it's a lot, especially if you're on the move quickly trying to grasp these issues, or if you're just kind of dipping your toe in. I appreciate that they exist, that there are these CRS reports, and then I appreciate that you've created something that complements them, I think, with your reports.
And I think it makes a difference too if you've had to do the work of developing the policy and implementing the policy, and then looking back on, like, oh, how do you explain how all this works now? I think that it's a different lens than CRS.
You worked for Congress in a congressional committee capacity. You also were in the role of implementing the policies while serving at the U.S. Department of Education under the Bush administration.
I was Associate Deputy Secretary for Policy, but then bounced in the undersecretaries. I was there long enough that I was in Undersecretary and Deputy Secretary a couple times.
Let's talk a little bit about the major K-12 federal programs that fall under the U.S. Department of Education's umbrella. So there's the big formula programs, Title I, IDEA. There's the small competitive grants, including charter school program, and you are the nation's expert on CSP. And we say small, but that's up to $500 million now. Yep. You pointed out in this report that 90% of federal K-12 spending is allocated via formula grants. So as much as the competitions and the competitive grants take up staff time and get attention in the media nationwide, it's really these formula grants that are driving K-12 funding and policy from a federal level.
That's right. I think that they have some of the longest histories too in the federal statutes in terms of the original purpose, Title I being in the original Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the charter schools program coming along much later. Yeah. And so where there's broad agreement on what a law is going to do, you're able to put a lot more resources behind that. And so some may say that Title I actually probably goes to too many districts. It's has several formulas in it that are designed to target different types of poverty and concentrations of poverty. The poverty data drives the allocation of the funds, but any kid can benefit from it, whether or not they're poor. There's a lot of agreement and there's a lot of flexibility in that program. IDEA is a very different animal with a large number of resources as well. There's not one size that fits all for types of programs. So you can agree on what 90% of the districts or most districts will need and the support that they're getting from the government. And then you have these other more boutique competitive grant programs that serve distinct purposes, right? That not everyone's going to apply for, not everyone's going to get, nor should they. Like they're serving different purposes. So that's one way to look at it.
When we're talking small versus large, competitive versus formula, I mentioned that CSP charter school program, that's $500 million. That's a big one when it comes to competitive. When we're talking Title I formula grant, $18 billion, I think is probably where we are with appropriation. IDEA, smaller than that, but of that scale. So billions versus millions. And again, like you said, they've been in existence for a long time. Title I, part of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So you're talking since 1965, long before the creation of the U.S. Department of Education, which came into being in 1980. IDEA, originally the law had a different name when it was passed 50 years ago. So 1975, again, before the creation of the U.S. Department of Education. These have been around for a long time. They've been described by Secretary McMahon as funding that passes through the department. She describes the U.S. Department of Education as a pass-through agency, meaning Congress appropriates these funds and has for many decades, and then the department passes them along to states, again, mostly by formula, that are established by law. So would you agree with that characterization of the department as a pass-through agency? Or how would you describe the department's role in this process of allocating these funds?
I would not generalize the role of the Department of Ed as a pass-through agency. I think if it were, there would be a lot of things that are a lot less complicated than we're talking about right now. Mm-hmm. I think in a perfect world, the Department of Education is adding significant value to the dollars in addition to how Congress has directed the flow of those dollars through formula. Standing and experience with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, there are more people that experience the law itself and its directives down to the local level in a way that the federal requirements just go down in a lot more detail down to the local level to protect kids and their right to a free and appropriate education. I think because of that, there's a lot of technical assistance and resources that come alongside of that to ensure that there's compliance. When you have a private right of action to sue because you're not getting FAPE, that triggers a lot of resources. So I think it would be inaccurate to call IDEA a pass-through program for those reasons. I think on Title I, there's a significant component of it that's about getting resources where there aren't enough resources because of statewide poverty, statewide formula allocations, how districts choose to fund lower poverty and higher poverty schools. So there's a focus in thinking about where the money needs to go to help the neediest kids. And then over the years, an accountability requirement has been layered on top of that as people have realized, well, maybe just sending money through formulas is not quite enough. There needs to be some more reporting and accountability on top of that. And then you have state educational agencies. They're not staffed to necessarily be creative, and this is not disparaging on any of them. There's way different capacities depending on how they've chosen to staff those agencies. But they may rely on folks at the department to a great degree to understand like what are the best ways, what are other states doing. So there is value that is added as states develop their assessments, as they develop their accountability systems. They're really looking to the department. Does the department do it perfectly? No. Does it do it perfectly in the context of smaller competitive grant programs? No. But but your question was whether or not they're pass-throughs, and I would say no.
I hear you saying no, and I hear you saying, well, that there's these layers of accountability. I would maybe characterize it more of layers of compliance. And then you mentioned that the states are looking to the department for maybe best practices. You didn't use that term, but like the idea of like, well, what are other states doing? I would say that's because the states are afraid of getting in trouble from the department. So it's not necessarily that, this inherent like desire to do better. It's a desire to not be punished for
Sure.
what they are doing. So they're seeking permission, they're seeking protection from this compliance regime. So maybe I would characterize it differently. And part of that's from working at the Florida Department of Education years ago. So I've done both the U.S. Department of Education and the Florida Department of Education. And there's a lot of fear at the state level that you're going to get in trouble.
Well, yeah. And I think, again, on the IDEA side of things, where the you're dealing with a different requirement and a baseline from the federal government for free and appropriate education. Like there is definitely compliant. I mean, that is one of the big struggles of IDEA. How do you focus on real outcomes and not box checking? Because that's the easiest thing to do. I think states want to know, okay, what did you say some other state did? Can we do that? Because it's not just a fear, but it's also like in this context of waivers right now, Indiana is doing a lot of hard work thinking about, okay, under the current requirements of federal law, what are some creative things we can do? Are other states doing that, or are they just waiting for Indiana and then copy paste, right? So this gets to the issue of how the agencies are staffed. If you're staffing with compliance-focused grants management people, that's the perspective they bring to the program. If you staff with folks that are looking at broader objectives and outcomes and are looking at how do we use the tools that we have to get there, you're in a very different place. And over the years that I've worked in the space of trying to get flexibility to the states, this is what I've seen time and time again, that if you have overworked, understaffed SEA offices, the last thing they want to hear is, would you like to apply for a waiver demo under a state flex or some kind of flexibility authority, which we had for a number of years that we only ever contorted Washington State to apply for, I think, or Seattle, someone. And they just didn't want the extra work of trying to get the extra flexibility because that's not their role as they were staff. Or like, look, we get the money out the door to the districts. You're asking something of us is not what we're designed to do.
Right. You're talking about the need for investment in talent and then also a shift in mindset. So that's different than what I talk about a lot on the podcast, which is like process things. Well, now the department is encouraging waiver applications. Well, you're saying that's nice, but you have to have these other things happen at the state level for the states to really embrace that and run with that. I would say that if states have applied enough for predecessors to waivers, for flexibility, for alternative assessments and been slapped down, there's also kind of this defeatist mentality of like,
Sure.
I have limited time and resources and it's a gamble and I'm not going to invest in this thing that maybe is not going to pan out. So there's that risk aversion based on past experience that might happen too. I'm curious about your perspective on the interagency agreements. So at this point, as we're recording, the Department of Education has announced 10 with, I believe, 5 different federal agencies: labor, state, HHS, Interior, and then the most recent one was the Department of Treasury. That was a higher education announcement. They're moving the Federal Student Aid Office, FSA, over to Treasury. But some of these others, K-12, love to hear your thoughts, your interpretation of what an IAA is, interagency agreement, and your thoughts on this approach.
I have written a paper on this, at least surfacing like some of the initial questions that are answered about how these IAAs will work. The interagency agreement mechanism has been used in the past on a much smaller scale to provide a framework outside of Congress for agencies to work together on a project as co-equals, not one like, will you do my dirty work for me? Or like, this is not something we want to do. Like, this is something that we're going to work on together, a joint project. So that's what IAAs are. They're being used at a scale and for a purpose that has not been tested before. I think one of the questions that I've been trying to understand is what problems are being solved by the IAAs, like, because just doing the math, having a state deal with two separate agency rules for a single program doesn't math well in terms of streamlining and getting programs out of the way that aren't working and things back to the states.
Why would they have to interact with two agencies? If the IAA is saying, hey, these particular programs are moving over to labor or to HHS, Health and Human Services, and the staff are going with them, we're detailing the Department of Education grants management staff, why would a state have to interact with two agencies?
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends on what suite of programs they are working with and to what degree they're elevating and having to deal with policy challenges. So it's a little hard to know right now because the changes haven't taken place, particularly in the K-12 environment. They have in the labor environment. So everyone's still talking to folks at the Department of Ed. But there's always a point where you have a funding issue, which is my understanding that the grant allocations would be coming out of labor. And there's always some kind of policy issue, which is my understanding is that staying at the Department of Ed. The thing that hasn't really been talked about a lot are the grant management structures themselves, like G5, which was designed for Department of Ed programming. You can't just like plop that over to labor. I think that was one of the initial issues that they were running into at labor was having to use their grant management system, which isn't designed for the types of programs that moved over there. And it's hard to articulate if you haven't been on the other side of having to manage a G5 grant, which I wasn't when I was at the Department of Ed, but since then have been a grantee and have had to work with the program officers on the policy side and the grants management side for a particular grant, which has policy implications in it. So it's all very connected. You can't separate them.
Yeah, so you point out the G5 grant management platform issues is something to keep an eye on. And then contract and procurement rules for labor programs are not the same as the education department's programs. So you've got different ways of operating across the different departments. And then you expressed a concern that all this might slow down funding and increase timelines for states to get answers. So we don't have evidence of that, I guess you're saying, because it hasn't rolled out, except if you're talking about workforce.
They've moved over, yeah, but there have been a lot of bumps on the road on the state side in terms of figuring out the nuts and bolts, again, of these grants management entities that you need to draw down your funds and demonstrate that you've submitted your performance reports. You don't automatically get your next year of funding. There has to be a policy person who's deciding whether or not you've met your performance targets that you put in your grant, if it's a competitive grant. So yeah, I think that there could be a division of labor in theory. When there's disagreement, each agency is equal. There's sort of an assumption that there won't be disagreement or disputes that have to get resolved. But you could imagine someone having, equally valid opinions on either side. That happens all the time within an agency. How is that all getting worked out? This is all kind of missing the larger point, though, that there's a lot of energy that's being directed towards this process that's potentially further siloing programs that we're talking about, like how do we get these things to work together and in a way that's not a pendulum swinging back and forth all the time. These aren't codified. They could change again. Like it's this way this year. What will it be like next year? How do you get to the point that Congress is the one that prevents the pendulum from swinging and actually causes the coordination? Things aren't magically coordinated just because all of a sudden they're in the Department of Labor. Those programs themselves have to talk to each other.
You've written that Congress created the Department of Education, and it can only be dissolved through legislative action and a change in the statute. So when we're talking about these IAAs with multiple federal agencies, that is what the administration officials are calling like a proof of concept. They're trying to show Congress that the Department of Education can be dissolved. And they have been very clear that they agree with you that it can only be dissolved through legislative action and a change in the statute. Do you see any interest or momentum in Congress to take action on this front? Have you seen that in years past?
No. it feels like
There certainly was lip service. I mean, we certainly
of
had
course,
talking
yes,
points on
yes.
that.
I would say in the mid 90s,
Yes.
closer to the creation of the department, that was seen as let's try to undo something that's a relatively new agency. In the mid 90s, there was a proposal to get rid of 10 cabinet agencies, not just the Department of Education. Back with the Contract with America, dating myself, yes, but the Department of Ed was one of those. And there were several bills in Congress to get rid of them. But even my time in the Education and Workforce Committee, working on the Education at a Crossroads project, that was about making it work better, not getting rid of it. Because again, what problem are we solving? What is not working well? What is the best way to make the solutions? If your problem is just the mere existence of an agency and not the educational problems that kids are facing, then yeah, maybe that is a proof of concept that it doesn't have to technically exist for the programs to get the money out the door. But again, what is the larger problem that we're trying to solve? And what is the best way to ensure that kids and parents are getting transparent information and value out of the tax dollars that are going to Washington to fund these programs?
Let's just pause for a minute and have a moment of nostalgia for that Education at a Crossroads report. You and I were both working on the Hill at that time. So this was a 1998 report. You still have that looks so familiar. Yes, I had that at my desk for a long time.
Than I remembered it being, but I found one in a box recently. Yeah.
So this identified over 760 federal education programs spread across 39 agencies. So this idea that states are going to have to talk to multiple agencies, well, they've been doing that the whole time. The idea was to figure out what's working, what's wasted, and what should be done. And it doesn't seem like we've found a solution to that. It was a helpful conversation to have in the 90s. And then federal education policy went a different direction, especially with No Child Left Behind. And it seems like now we're opening that conversation again. But I think I hear what you're saying is, let's not get caught up in the mechanics of dismantling without a bigger picture goal of what we're trying to do. So what are the big picture recommendations that you have? If not IAAs, maybe if not waivers, then what should the department be thinking about? Or what should the administration, what should Congress be thinking about?
Let's find the real sticking points, and then we're going to need to go to Congress to address those sticking points, not move a program somewhere else. So really one of the sticking points is where states want to use funds within state. Most of the waivers that are coming in, where they're getting pushback is where waivers are not authorized under law, and that there are a lot of hands being tied, states' hands being tied when it comes to decisions about where to send the money in the states. And there have been efforts in the past to try to get on the table, can a state at least request a waiver to change how funds go within a state for different purposes? Can they have more flexibility about how they use their state set-asides and the funds themselves? So why can't we come to an agreement maybe and put on an appropriations bill that you can reallocate funds within state for certain purposes, as long as they're not, decreasing funds for high poverty, whatever safeguards you wanted, but maybe we can open that door. And then all of a sudden you're having a different conversation for the types of waivers states can have. But that's just an example. I'm not putting that forward as like the answer, but let's talk about the pain points that states are having and what they want to do. And that's a hard process. It's what I've learned over the years. It requires real listening and translating, because sometimes what people are feeling and experiencing at the state and local level are not because of federal requirements, because of state layers that they put on top of it. Another example, the Title I school-wide program authority, which allows schools to consolidate all of their federal funds and just use them for any purpose under ESEA. So it's like the most flexible block grant that you can think of with IDEA, ESEA. You're just serving the kids. You're potentially relieved from a lot of the individual tracking. There's one state that we have evidence for that's really been able to push that consolidation implementation down to the local level. And this has been an authority that's been in place for 30 years. That is because of state accounting rules that get in the way. And that takes a lot of work to break that down.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So who should go about taking a look at those state obstacles? There's a lot of conversation right now with the administration trying to get the federal obstacles out of the way. Is that up to the individual states? Is that organizations like yours?
Louisiana is an example of a state that at the state level, at least, not necessarily down at the school-wide consolidation level, looked at how to so districts have not been required to submit a bunch of different applications for all these federal programs. They've been able to have a consolidated application, but they haven't been able to map as well their federal resources to their local purposes without looking at the lines of the programs themselves. So this is something called super apps. So that's just one example of a state with an experience, and now folks who were in the trenches of making that work and breaking down the state silos. So that's a lot of individual state work that needs to be done to help the state have the capacity and the policy environment they need in place. It would be great if the department was doing more to support that intentionally through technical assistance or even it was prioritized and not implied that they're just ready and waiting to do the thing as soon as they get the ability to request a waiver. It's a great opportunity for organizations that, like the Council of Chief State School Officers or other information sharing organizations, Education Commission of the States, to really look for those. They're kind of boring examples of how you have to get rid of those statewide accounting codes that get things away, but they're important. And so you got to have folks that are willing to roll up their sleeves and kind of do the drudge work.
I'm so glad that you mentioned this as something that needs more attention. I feel like there's too much discourse that is, here's one political perspective and here's the other political perspective. Here's the administration versus here's the union. And then whatever is being discussed or done or needs to be discussed and done just gets lost in that. So this sounds like that bipartisan policy in the middle that absolutely needs to.
A national summit on how to consolidate school-wide funds.
That sounds so fun, Christy.
But there used to be more of an emphasis on that and work. And there's some things that feel like, well, maybe we shouldn't have to do this because everything else was fixed. But things just move slowly. And so take advantage of the opportunities that you have to direct resources to things that really have an impact.
How can people follow your work?
We have a K-12 section of the BPC website. We also have something called BPCU, which is a great place to interact with 101 explainers on a bunch of different issues, because I know a lot of folks, especially if they're not on committee, are covering a lot of issues. So I'd really encourage that. I do try to stay active on LinkedIn to provide a preview or conversations about some of the work that I'm writing.
Christy, thank you for your commitment to intentional implementation of federal and state education policy. And thank you for joining Freedom to Learn.
Thank you so much, Denny, and thanks for all you do with your work to help shed more light on all that's going on around here.
Freedom to Learn is a production of the Defense of Freedom Institute. Learn more about our work at dfipolicy.org. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Send feedback, questions, and episode ideas to podcast@dfipolicy.org. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, please follow and review Freedom to Learn on your favorite podcast app and share it with a friend.